we're going to get started on this tour of Portsmouth. I have quite a few slides to show you, and for the most part, a lot of what I am going to be showing you is elaborated on even more so in a book I did about 14 years ago, traveling around to Quinnipiac Island. This series of lectures has been coordinated between me and the Portsmouth Town Library. It is supported by and enhanced by the activities of the Portsmouth Library. So here we go. This painting, this is a painting actually that is owned by Beverly Hall, and she had it in her office down the hall here for many, many years, and I borrowed it from her one time, was able to make some copies of it. It's the Bristol Fairy and one of the buses to Providence coming off the Bristol Ferry. So what I'm going to talk about for the most part is public transportation. Public transportation, and the era that I focus on for the most part in my research is roughly this 1890-1930 period, because it's a period in which there was a lot of things going on, a lot of changes happening in transportation. And so we went from very primitive transportation to automobiles, and we got all the way to that. So also what I'm going to be going over a lot is the transportation on the island, because Portsmouth and everybody else were all inextricably linked together. You could get a trolley, for example, at Morton Park in Newport, and you could take it out the West Main Road, or out the East Main Road actually, and another one went out the West Main Road, and you could get to Bristol Ferry, or you could get to the Stone Bridge. And when you did that, you would then transfer to another trolley in most cases, or take a steamboat from Bristol Ferry and work your way all the way. You actually could take a trolley from Newport to Nashua, New Hampshire. 4.5 hours, and probably a really sore backside, because sitting on those trolleys was not terribly comfortable. So we had a lot of, and my focus is on trolleys, railroads, steamboats, and ferries. These are the four modes of transportation that I'm going to talk about tonight. So we're going to highlight this. I really can't go into a lot of detail, for example, on some of these things, but I'll do the best I can and try to give you a little bit of stimulation about how people got around. Okay. First of all, we'll deal with the ferries. Again, we need to be reminded that we do, in fact, live on an island. And we had to get off this island somehow. And it was very difficult, in a lot of cases, to make any kind of time getting off the island, because you had to rely on the ferries, and I think enough of us probably remember riding fast as we could across Jamestown to try to catch the last ferry at night over to Newport. And if you didn't, you had to, as the phrase was, go around, which meant all the way to Providence and back down again. So, but there were three basic points of departure for the ferries. We had the area of Bristol Ferry, which is obviously, I think most of you know where that is, the area of the Stone Bridge, and also downtown Newport, various locations there. But we had ferries all the way up and down the Sakonnet River. It's hard to believe. I found a book that was written in 1926 about Rhode Island ferries, and one big chapter of it is about the Sakonnet River ferries. And at different times, there were as many as 8 or 9 ferries across the Sakonnet River. Taggart's Ferry from Middletown. There was a ferry from Fogman Point over to near the Glen Manor House, where the Glen Manor House is. And some of these ferries go back a long time, such as Bristol Ferry. When the first one was established there, it was a rowboat in 1640. And so they were proliferated around here, and I'll get into the bridges in a minute. But we also had a rather unique experience, and I talked about this in my last lecture, but I didn't have the picture to show you. It's actually a drawing. But there really was, for a time at Bristol Ferry, there was a 2-horsepower ferry, and this is what it looked like. The horses actually walked the treadmill, which turned the ship, made the ship move, turned the paddle wheel, and made the ship move. I'm not sure what purpose the cow served there, but anyway, I guess it was a farmer getting his stuff across. But eventually, over time, after rowboats, steam horse-powered ferries, we got into steam ferries at Bristol Ferry. And the most important ones after 1903 were owned by the trolley line. They had kind of a monopoly on it. You would take the trolley from Newport to Bristol Ferry and then get on the steamboats owned by the trolley company to go over to Bristol. And when you got to Bristol, you would get to what's Constitution Avenue. That's sort of around the corner in Bristol, down past the point there. It's sort of, the landing was right close, just south of where the Prudence Island Ferry is today. But anyway, the two major ferries in the early 20th century that were used to get across were first the Sagamore, which was a former yacht, the statistics say that this held 300 people. I can't believe that, but that's what it said. Anyway, that was the first effort, and obviously this was just for passengers. You couldn't put any cars or horse and buggies on this or anything. Then we had the Bristol, which came along in 1905, and this is a wonderful picture. If you really look closely at it and see the cars coming off the ferry. I got this picture as a glass plate negative, and unfortunately, glass plates, which are usually extremely sharp, I wasn't able to read the scale over here, the rate scale for the ferry. It probably was fairly expensive by any standards. When the Mount Hope Bridge opened, by the way, the rate was something like $1.10, $1.25. So it cost a lot, but this wonderful car right here, and you can see that you know, other cars coming off the ferry over here. It's kind of really a neat picture. But that's the Bristol, and the Bristol was the one you saw on the first slide, the color painting. That was the Bristol as well. This is another picture of the Bristol, and one of the Fagioli coaches going on. The coaches brought about the demise of the trolleys. Once the buses started to run, they were much more flexible than the trolleys, which were tied to the rails, and so the buses eventually replaced the trolley line. But at the same time, the people who owned the trolley line invested in the bus company. And one of the main people involved in that, probably the main person involved in the transition from the trolley line to the buses, was William H. Vanderbilt, who lived at Oakland Farm here, or one of his summer house was at Oakland Farm here in Portsmouth. He later went on to develop what was called the short line, and that evolved over several generations, and now is Peter Pan, the buses we see. The ferries continued to serve the public in that area until the completion of the Mount Hope Bridge. This is the Mount Hope Bridge under construction. One of the interesting stories about the Mount Hope Bridge is that when they built it, they decided, and it was built privately, by the way. A private corporation built it, later sold it to the state. But when they were building it, they tried a new system of cabling, you know, the cables that run from the towers and so on. And then when they put the cabling up, they hang the deck plates from it. And this was an experimental type of cabling, and what they realized was that the cabling wasn't going to hold the weight of the deck plates, so they had to lower them all, take the cabling down, and recable the bridge. And at that, it cost them about, I think it was $6 million, something like that, to build the bridge. Think about how much it's costing for the new Secunda River Bridge. What is it, 180, 190 million, something like that. The good old days. Anyway, there were ferries across the Secunda River in the vicinity of the Stone Bridge, and we have to give Rhode Island directions. You know where the Stone Bridge used to be? That's where the ferries were across. And the main one there was Howland's Ferry that goes back to the 17th century. And this is a map, or a photograph that shows you the remains of the Stone Bridge, and again, where the ferry went across. That's the closest proximity in that area. And again, anyone who's gone through there in a sailboat knows that there's a wicked rip current through there, and so they had a lot of problems. And they had a lot of problems at the Stone Bridge as well that I'm going to get into. But this was a photograph that was taken in 1999 by me. I took it on a helicopter, but it shows you the location of the Stone Bridge. The first effort to build a bridge across the area of the Stone Bridge was 1795. And that was a wooden bridge, and it didn't last very long. It lasted until 1796. Then they built another one, and then that one didn't last very long either. We had what was called the September Gale of 1815 that wiped out the bridge. We had another huge gale in 1865 that came through there. These are hurricanes, but nobody used that word then. In 1865, and then at the turn of the century, they decided to put up what was called a double lift roller bridge, double roller lift bridge, and that's what you see right here. And it's under construction. You can see that there's no plating on the pieces that are up there. They were rebuilding it in 1907, June 8th, 1907. At my last talk, I talked about a particular photographer by the name of O.E. Du Bois, and Du Bois was a Fall River photographer who photographed this area a lot, and it's amazing. This is one of his photographs. They're identified often by the fact that the type name is on there. And he didn't spell bridge right, but that's okay. Well, I did a book on him in 1983 when I had about 60, 65 of his postcards. I figured, how am I going to find any more? I now have 570 of them. And they're wonderful photographs, like this one. I mean, that's just so neat, the way he stopped over on Main Road in Tiverton and looked back to take a picture of the bridge. But see these arches that they had on the sides and so on, they didn't hold up to the current going through there either, and so they had to be replaced. The final stone bridge, again, one was built in 1912, had to be replaced in 1913, and that was the last one. And the stone bridge lasted until the construction of the Secana River Bridge. This is another view of the stone bridge from the Portsmouth side, looking across. Here's the stone bridge in over here. But again, heavy traffic. This was the only bridge off the island at that time. The only bridge off the island until 1929. Okay? And again, this is the 1912, 1913 bridge. But again, heavy traffic, as you can see. And there were trolley lines down the middle of it, by the way. The trolleys went across as well. So again, that's a Du Bois postcard, and his photography is wonderful. I shouldn't talk about him too much, because one time I bought a lot of his cards back in the 70s, and one time I went to a flea market and I was buying some, and I said, wow, I got some of these for $1.50, but now these are $7. And the person looked at me and said, yeah, some guy wrote a book about this. Thanks a lot. So he still didn't give me a discount either. When the stone bridge was under repair, especially in the 1907 to 1913 period, they used small ferries. This is the west side, which was a small ferry. And again, you can't see it too well, but there's a car right here, a very early motor car. This is another Du Bois postcard, by the way. The crew is all up here, and you can see a separate ladies' room and men's room there too. That's a pretty fancy bridge for those days. And this is another picture of the west side, a postcard from the west side coming over to Portsmouth. You can see the abutment of the stone bridge right there on the edge of the picture. But again, this was the only way you could get across the Secana River, was by ferry. And there's just one more picture of, oh well, I'll get to that in a minute. This is what the stone bridge looked like, the 1913 stone bridge. And again, there are some views. John Pierce, in his book on Portsmouth, has an aerial view of this that shows the stone bridge out in the middle of nowhere. It's a wonderful photograph, but it just shows how vulnerable this bridge was. But this is what it looked like. And it was used until it was replaced by the Secana River Bridge in 1956. They opened it for every boat that went through. And in some cases, I was reading a story the other day about the fact that during Prohibition, which is my next lecture, by the way, in June, during Prohibition, they sometimes would open the boat for the rum runners to go through, and then they'd close it before the Coast Guard got there. It was hand-tended, by the way. It was machine tended, but by man. Yeah, they had someone there tending it. And you can see Gould Island in the background here, Rattlesnake Island down here. But there's these little cabs up on top where the bridge operators worked. The railroads on Aquidneck Island, and obviously we still have the railroad, they came about as an extension of a line called the Old Colony Road, the Old Colony Railroad, which started out in Boston as a route from Boston to Plymouth in 1844. They chartered it, and we have to think about railroads steam power was added to railroads probably about 1809, 1811 in that period. And by the 30s and 40s, because of the expansion of the United States westward, railroads were becoming popular. It's an interesting saga, not so much here, but in New York, Pennsylvania, that area. It was also an era of significant canal building. And as the canals were built, like the Erie Canal in upstate New York, the railroads, as they came along, went right alongside them. And obviously the railroads put the canals out of business, or certainly limited the business that the canals could have. But the Old Colony line was a rather substantial one in this area. They did have a 41-mile line from in the area of Taunton. Some of you may not know where these places are. Myricks, Middleborough, Bridgewater, and so on. And eventually, the link was from Boston to Fall River. And that was opened in 1846. And it was called the Fall River Railroad. It combined with the Old Colony line in 1854. And they also ran a steamboat line. And I think you're all familiar with that, the Fall River line. That was run by the railroad company, which started in 1847 and lasted for 90 years. Went out of business in 1937. Newport wanted rail service too, and again, we're on an island. That was a problem. So they decided that they would build a line, extend the line during the Civil War. Between 1862 and 1864, the line was laid along the west side of the island and became known as the Old Colony and Newport Railroad. That very much offended the people of Fall River, because they had the Old Colony and Fall River line. And they were upset about the fact that they were now just a way station along the way of the river. And so they got really offended about that. But again, they needed a bridge to cross the Sakonnet River, and they built one, and it was sort of like some of those early stone bridges. There was a lot of rocks in there as a base, which did not do well. And eventually they built this new shining bridge. This was in 1899. And this is from the Portsmouth side, as you can tell from the buildings in Tiverton across the way. Bright, new, shiny bridge. We all remember that, I think, because it wasn't very long ago it disappeared. And this is where it was. Again, you've got the railroad bridge that ran from Tiverton over here. The Tiverton station was right here, and it went across. It was a swing bridge, and usually kept open unless they needed a train needed to get across. And then it went across over this way by Montauk Country Club and so on over to the west side of the island. Again, this is the second bridge that was built. The first one didn't last very long. It's only, well, 30 years it lasted. And this one lasted until 1988 when it was damaged by a barge and rendered inoperable. And then we sat there and looked at it for about the next, what, 20 years or so before they finally tore it down. A real hazard to navigation. This is one of the trains in Newport. You can see the Old Colony really kept their trains up pretty well. This is nice, shiny. Probably was brand new, I don't know, but that's the, and that was in Newport. The railroads, when you got to Newport, the train station, the big Newport train station, was right about where the Old Colony and Newport Little Station is today, right by the Marriott there. But then you could extend, the tracks extended across Long Wharf and went out to the end of Long Wharf where the steamboats landed. And so you could take a train from Portsmouth to downtown Newport and jump on the Fall River line from there, which was, again, a very common thing done. I'm going to talk about the Fall River line in a minute. But that whole area of Cardine's Field and that area in there was, first of all, it was a swamp. It was a pond. And later, when it was filled in, the railroad tracks all the way across there. You know, J.T. O'Connell was established fairly early in the 20th century, and they had a lot of their supplies come in by rail that way. But that whole point of Long Wharf in that area was a lot of railroad sort of just behind the wharf itself. Eventually, and there were many amalgamations of railroad lines. And the Old Colony eventually became the New York, New Haven, and Hartford Railroad in 1893. And you had some big-time operators in the railroad business. Probably one of the most significant was Cornelius Vanderbilt, who established the New York Central Railroad. But I'll talk about him in just a minute, too. The passenger traffic on the train was substantial. In 1913, there literally were 12 passenger trains into Newport and 12 passenger trains out of Newport every day. Now, by trains in those days, we probably mean, for the most part, maybe 2 cars, 2 passenger cars. It wasn't like there was, 25 cars or anything like that. But it was a substantial amount of traffic that came that way by train. The main Portsmouth station was at Willow Lane. As you go down Willow Lane, just before you get to the Carnegie Abbey Tower there, just before you cross the tracks, it was on the left there. And in 1915, this station, with the station master inside, was knocked off its base by a runaway train, a train that went off the track. And he survived, however. But this was what the Portsmouth station looked like, and then it was replaced after that by this one. And this one, the photograph here fades a little bit. There actually is a roof on the top of that. It's a Victorian building. Again, some of us remember, I took pictures of it with my first book in 1976. It was still there until the fire department decided to use it for practice. It had been abandoned, obviously, because passenger traffic ceased in 1937. But again, this building behind, kind of interesting. This was a school at the coal mines. And coal mines was a separate village, if you will, of Portsmouth. They had their own school, they had their own church. What ultimately became St. Anthony's Church was started there. And it had its own sort of culture in the patch there. You have to wait till November when I do my lecture on the coal mines. More about that. Okay. Other stations, Portsmouth had a lot of stations. I mean, from Long Wharf to Newport to Middletown, there were a lot of stations further on out in Portsmouth. This was the Bristol Ferry station. And the Bristol Ferry station was right at where the tracks cross on the town common there. And you can see in the back, you can see the Bristol Inn, which later became, part of which became the country club there. And it had a fire in 1914 that lowered it to 1 story. Some of you may remember Barbara Kearney, and Barbara told me that one time that's her father reading the newspaper on the steps of it. And he was quite an operator, Alexander Moon. Anyway, that was the Bristol Ferry Station, which was pretty substantial, as you can see. We also had sort of shed stations along the way, and this one was at the foot of Corey's Lane. And it's an interesting photograph because, first of all, you can see down here C-O-R-E-Y-S, okay? You can see here C-O-R-Y-S. And up here, you can't see it on this picture because it's a copy of a copy, but it's C-O-R-E-Y-S. So they couldn't decide how to spell it. And I spent 39 years at the Abbey trying to spell it too. It always came out different ways. But anyway, Corey's Lane, that was at the foot of Corey's Lane. And George Mendonça told me he remembered tearing that down in the 1930s or something. The reason there was a flag stop there was that the Green Animals was owned by a man by the name of Thomas Brayton. And Thomas Brayton was a director of the Old Colony Railroad. And so if he wanted to go to Fall River, he hung out his flag and trains stopped and picked him up. Anyway, that disappeared probably in the 30s sometime. But passenger service declined. Again, all of these mass transportation forms declined primarily because of the automobile, the bus, and other transportation that came along to replace it. Again, the first automobile of any consequence was probably, 1905, 1906, in that era. And of course, in 1914, we got the Model T Ford with the assembly line by Henry Ford. And so they really took off. But there's some great automobile stories. I came across one and I misplaced it, but a story of some people who left Newport in this huge Packard and decided to drive to Secaucus Point. And it was a fascinating story because they stopped twice because the car went off the dirt road and they had to replace a wheel. And I mean, it took them about a whole day to get from Newport to Secaucus Point. Anyway, so the passenger traffic slowed down and then stopped altogether in 1938 as the New York, New Haven, Hartford declared bankruptcy at that time. We were relegated, as I was a teacher at the Abbey, we were relegated a lot by stories of old alums who said, oh yes, I remember coming to school by train. and carrying their suitcases up the hill. Probably had somebody carry them for them, I don't know. But anyway, but freight service continued, and freight service continued to support the Navy base, Weyerhaeuser, J.T. O'Connell, and a number of other places until the railroad bridge was damaged in 1988. And of course, we still have the railroad today with the Old Colony Newport tourist train and the dinner train there on the same tracks. And there's been a lot of talk about building a bike path along there somewhere, and that may happen yet. It's state-owned land at this point, and goes all the way to the former railroad bridge in Common Fence Point. Another station in Portsmouth was at Melville, and at Melville, during the Civil War, while the railroad was being built, there was a Civil War hospital there. And that Civil War hospital is the subject of a book written by Frank Gribb that maybe some of you have heard his lecture. I think I read in the paper the other day, he's going to be on Portsmouth this week on local access TV. And that's a fascinating story because the book's great. He did a lot of research on that. And it was a hospital for both Union and Confederate wounded during the Civil War. And there was an estate there that the hospital was built around. They built all these pavilions off it. And it was quite a busy place during the Civil War. And as the war ended, they auctioned off all the property. They moved a lot of the graves down to New York, and there's no sign of it left. This picture, though, I can remember. This was sort of right near the Melville Grill, before you make the last turn to go down to Melville Grill. It was over on the right. Some of us, including myself, who remember the Navy days in Melville, when ComServe 2 had its headquarters there on that property. That was the same place where the hospital was. And the remains of that bridge behind there are still around. The bridge isn't there anymore, but you can see the pilings that were there for it. And then you can see here, what's important also is that the railroad in this area was double track. Most of it was double track. That was important because if you didn't double track, and they had the same problem with trolleys, if you didn't double track, you had to have way outs. You had to get out of the way while the other train went by. And so that was, double tracking was a big step forward. Steamboats. Okay, the first steamboat, believe it or not, its name was Steamboat. And it was an experimental thing that was done on the Hudson River. And very soon after that, Robert Fulton was playing around with the Claremont, which always gets the credit for being the first steamboat. But an entrepreneur named Cornelius Ant Vanderbilt got really into that early. And he took over the steamboats on the Hudson River. And then he got involved with, as I said before, with the New York Central Railroad. Vanderbilt was a big-time operator in the railroad business as well as in the steamboat business. There were a series of steamboats that ran from Newport to New York City. And the first one was the Firefly in 1817. Okay? I'm not sure I'd want to go out on Long Island Sound on a steamboat in 1817, but they did. And a whole bunch of companies evolved. And I just listed a couple of them here. The Rhode Island and New York Steamboat Company, the Boston, Newport, and New York Steamboat Company, Narragansett Steamship Company, which was owned by Jay Gould and Jim Fisk, who were big-time operators also in the age of the moguls. The Old Colony Steamboat Company, and so on. The night boats, again, some of you are probably familiar with this, but primarily the Fall River line went from Fall River to Newport to New York. And it would leave Fall River at about 5 or 6 o'clock in the evening. It would stop in Newport around 8 or 9 o'clock in the evening, and then get underway overnight for New York City. And it would land at a Fall River Line pier at the southern end of Manhattan. I came across, and they really were floating palaces. They were absolutely gorgeous boats and very comfortable. I have in my collection a guide, a price list for cabins in all the steamboats, and on the Providence, which was the biggest one, the average price for a steamboat ride to New York City was $1.50. And there was one cabin on the ship that was $10.50. I mean, that must have really been elegant. But then a lot of people, you know, took the night boat and slept in chairs in the lounges and things like that too. They couldn't afford a cabin. But anyway, the Fall River line is quite a story, and we still have the Maritime Museum in Fall River, which has a great display of a lot of that stuff. I have a lot of pictures myself, but I haven't done much with them. There also were other steamboats in the bay that went from one place to another, from Providence to Newport, or Providence to Bristol Ferry to Fall River, and around the bay in areas. And one of those was the Mount Hope, which I'll show you a picture of in a second, but first we have to see the Providence. Again, this was the most elegant of the Fall River Line steamboats, and just incredible. I mean, just wow. And then also we had the Mount Hope, which was a Narragansett Bay steamer, and this is it steaming into Newport Harbor. That's the end of Rhode Island on your right there in that picture. And again, and then we had the Richard Borden. The Richard Borden, we have a picture. I had a student at the Abbey whose grandmother gave me a glass plate negative, not really knowing what this thing is, and I had it enlarged, and I have a 16 by 20 of this picture hanging in my wife's office. She has it hanging in her office, and it's on the 16 by 20. Glass plates were so sharp that you actually, on the enlargement of this, you can see the hats on the people on the ship up there. And it's just amazing how sharp glass plate negatives were. And this was the Bristol Ferry, and this is the wharf, the buildings on the wharf. That was a freight station for a while, and a restaurant for a while, and a drug smuggling place for a while. Finally burned down in the, when was that, 70s, I guess? But Charlie Crouch ran it as a restaurant. It was a wonderful restaurant. I'm sure some of you remember it. And it had experienced a lot of ups and downs in terms of flooding and things like that over years. It's been here a long time. We also had the Sakonnet line steamers, which is, again, something that I'm particularly interested in. Sakonnet Point is one of the most beautiful places in Rhode Island, as far as I'm concerned. Still is, and we spent about, what, half hour there this afternoon. It's just a great place to photograph. I've gotten some of the best sunset photographs from that point. It's a little hard, access is a little harder these days now that they built a club out there. Not much place to park, but it's just a wonderful place. And in 1888, they built a hotel down there on a bluff overlooking the ocean at that point. And again, it was primarily reached by steamboats. The steamers would, well, let me get into this first. Also, there was the Davis House there. The Davis House was a shore dinner hall, if you will. And you could get a dinner. I've seen advertisements. I have advertisements for this. You could get chowder, fish, roast meats, clam cakes, lobsters, pudding, and pie for 50 cents in the 1880s and 90s. And a lot of people would take that day trip. It would take you about 3 hours from Providence to Sakonnet Point. And again, the cost, you could buy multiple tickets, but essentially the cost was about $1 for the trip. And it was a great place. You could just get down there and you could swim, you could, you know, just take in the airs and eat, obviously. And so there were a lot of different steamboats used by the Sakonnet line, including some I'm going to show you pictures of in a second, but the Queen City, the Islander, the Washonks, as they pronounce it in Little Compton, and others. Again, they would stop at various wharves along the way. They were commercial boats as well as passenger boats. They would pick up potatoes, fish, things like that, bring it back to Providence. And there were various wharves along the way. Bristol Ferry was one. Brownell's Wharf was another. Brownell's Wharf was down at the foot of Power Street on the Portsmouth side. And then Almy's Wharf over in Tiverton. And they would get to the point, again, about 3 hours or so. This is the Queen City, leaving Providence. And you can see all the empty barrels on the bow of the ship. And again, to be filled up with either potatoes or fish when they got to Sakonnet Point and brought back. But again, they took passengers too. And I imagine that was really a nice day trip to make that. Queen City was one of the most active ones. The Islander was another. This is the Islander. And again, busy day. It's probably a weekend day, a lot of passengers on it. This is Brownell's Wharf. Again, Brownell's Wharf was in Portsmouth, and at the edge of some property owned by the Brownell family. There's a big white house down on Water Street that was owned by the Brownells, and this was a wharf there. And one of the things they did at Brownell's Wharf was to bring the poles in there when they built the trolley line along the East Main Road. Again, this is another Du Bois postcard. You have the label on it there. Again, they're just wonderful pictures. And you have Gould Island in the background up here, and the Tiverton shore over there. This is one of my favorite pictures. I actually used this on the cover of my Du Bois book that I did. This is the Islander going up the Secundit River in the place there. You can't see it very well on the slide, but over here there are two ferry boats, the West Side and the J.A. Saunders, that were being used. This is again 1912 or so, when they were rebuilding the stone bridge. They were using these ferries right here that went across the Secundit River to carry the passengers over. But what's kind of neat here is you can see, some of you know, some old timers know, new people don't know very well, but the East Main Road turns into Chase's Lane when you get to just before the post office. And you can, this is Chase's Lane where this tree line is, all the way down here. And this is all Valhalla. Okay. Nothing there but Henry C. Anthony's farm fields. Henry C. Anthony was a seed grower, and he had farm fields all over this area. He had farms in Canada. He had farms in Cuba. He was a big-time operator and a state senator from Portsmouth. He lived, his house was as you turn off the East Main Road onto Park Avenue, start down the hill. The house on the first house on the left was Henry C. Anthony's home, and one of his daughters was Mrs. Wilkie, who was well known in Portsmouth history as well. Okay. But that's really kind of a neat period piece picture, probably taken, as it says, taken from Fort Barton up above the Tiverton Town Hall. The Secundit down at the point, the hotel later was changed to the Lyman because Thomas Lyman rebuilt it. And the price went up. It went to $2.50 a night there. But I guess that once you got there, you're kind of trapped there till the next steamboat came along. There were people who experimented with the idea, actually talked quite seriously about running a trolley from the Tiverton Railroad station at the end of the railroad bridge down Main Road to Little Compton. But there were a few people at Little Compton who didn't think that was a good idea because, again, it might bring too many people there. So they discounted that. They never actually built that, but it was being discussed. Again, the Secundit line was a freight line as well. It lasted until 1919, when again the trucks began to replace the steamboats as a means of loading the fish and the potatoes and so on, and taking them off to Providence or Fall River or wherever. But there are a series of wonderful books by a man by the name of Dave Patton, who died probably 20 years ago, but there are books about Little Compton, and they're absolutely he was a newspaper man for the Providence Journal, and he wrote articles that sort of folksy kind of things that are really neat, and they've been collected in a series of at least 3 books that he wrote, and they're just wonderful stories to read about some of the characters who lived in Little Compton. Now that whole area, Secundit Point, as well as everything around the Secundit River, was very active during Prohibition. Fighting against Prohibition, I might say. And in fact, the Coast Guard had a special name for the entrance to the Secundit River. They call it Times Square because that's where all the activity was. And again, I'm going to talk about Prohibition down in that area next month. I won't have pictures, however, because nobody took pictures while they were loading and unloading booms. Because some of those people had machine guns. But Portsmouth was very much involved in the rum running trade between 1919 and 1933. The last group that I want to talk about are the Trolleys, and I'm particularly fond of Trolleys because I grew up in Pittsburgh, and in Pittsburgh We rode the trolleys everywhere. I rode them to high school every day. And most of those are gone now. They have some light rail, but most of the trolleys are gone, replaced by buses. But with urbanization, as people moved from the farm into the cities, the trolleys became really important as a means of public transportation. They're even talking, it's kind of interesting, they're talking about reestablishing a trolley line in Providence now, from College Hill to downtown and a couple other runs. But I think it would be a very expensive proposition these days. The first trolley line came to Richmond, Virginia in 1888. And again, in a lot of places, they replaced a horse-drawn trolley that existed in some of those places as well. And for those that aren't familiar, the trolley lines run on tracks, and then there are poles and overhead wires that the trolley itself, which is the piece that goes up in the back of the trolley, connects to that line. The line is energized, and that propels the trolley. And the trolleys usually had two of those the trolley cars had two of those trolleys on them, so they didn't have to turn around. They would simply reverse and go back the other way. I'll show you pictures of that in a minute. But they were establishing a trolley line in Newport in 1889. That was the first one. And they called it, and again, these trolley lines went through about 6 different names and consolidations and so on. But the Newport Street Railway Company built 2 lines in Newport. The base was what is called Commercial Wharf in Newport, where there was a trolley barn and a power plant. And that's where they ran it from. And they ran it from Commercial Wharf. One line went across, went up the hill, up, up Franklin Street, and a little bit on Spring, and then up 11th Street, and eventually kept going from there to First Beach, Newport Beach. That was the crosstown line. That was the beach line. And then they had another one which ran, first of all, it started from Morton Park. Later on, it was extended back further to, well, right in front of St. Augustine's Church. And if you look just south of St. Augustine's Church, there's kind of a road that goes around in a loop. And that was the trolley line loop. They made that loop, and they came up past St. Augustine's and turned by Morton Park and went up to Spring that way. It went down Spring Street all the way to Broadway, and it got to 1 Mile Corner, where it stopped, right in front of the Sunoco station, right there. Okay. That was the end of the line at first, 1 Mile Corner. So those lines were initiated, they set these up really fast. 1889, August 1889, 8 months after they had been authorized, they started these 2 trolley lines. However, there was a great deal of controversy with the crosstown line because it had to cross Bellevue Avenue. And there were a lot of people on Bellevue Avenue who were very, very afraid that this was going to desecrate their sacred street. And that was the phrase that was used, desecrate that sacred avenue by crossing, okay? Just crossing Bellevue Avenue. Great controversy in the Newport newspapers about that. Interesting. But they succeeded. They built the trolley line. The trolley line was very successful. Again, 700,000 passengers, okay, to and from the beach. They later built an extension or a new trolley barn. They built a couple, and this one was in Portsmouth. This trolley barn was in Portsmouth, and where it was would be just north of the Citizens Bank, in that where they just built that big sort of business condo thing there. That's where it was, and it was built there when they extended the line. The main line went eventually from 1 Mile Corner out Broadway, took a right on the East Main Road, followed the East Main Road all the way out past here. You know this, we have this empty space across the street here, the big grass strip and so on there. That's where the trolley went. And down to Park Avenue, took a right on Park Avenue, down through Island Park, and went across the Stone Bridge. That was the line that went that way. They had a power station on near Power Street. That's why it's called Power Street. again, sort of right in down at Water Street from the Citizens Bank. And this was the power station that was there. It was a supplementary power station, not used for primarily power for the trolley line. It was coal-fed, but eventually used as a backup in case they needed extra power. And that also, as with the trolley barn, was destroyed just before World War II, even though the trolleys were long gone by then. So the trolley then went down along the East Main Road, crossed the Stone Bridge, where it met up with another trolley line from Fall River and Tiverton, and went across. This is a picture of the trolley coming back to the Portsmouth side from Fall River. This is earlier than the double roller lift bridge. This is a bridge that actually had this was before 1898, and it actually had, it was a swing bridge. The middle part of the bridge moved. That didn't last very long either. But this would be, this building, which is called the Toll House here, is right where 15 Point Road is. Okay, right in that area. But you even could walk across the bridge. And again, the only bridge off the island. Think about that. So that one became the Newport and Fall River Street Railway. And that line is really easy to trace today because, again, it was along, right across the street along the East Main Road. Okay. The only problem they had constructing it was the fact that what's called Townhouse Hill, which is where the Middletown Town Hall is, was too steep. And so they had to carve it down a little bit. And you can see that when you drive down there, if you dare take your eyes off the road. You can see there are sort of big banks up on the side. And you can see how they've carved it down. And that was the reason. The trolleys were a little finicky. They had trouble with some of the hills in town. I'm sure they had trouble with this hill right here. They didn't go very fast. The fastest those trolleys went was about 10 miles an hour. Of course, the speed limit was 5 miles an hour at the time. But anyway, so if you went from Newport, the end of the Newport line to Fall River, it was 18.61 miles. It took an hour and a half, and the cost was 5 cents a town. The trolley company also decided, and this was true nationwide, or eastern seaboard wide anyway, they decided to build a trolley park. And trolley parks were amusement parks that were established along trolley lines in order to increase ridership. And the trolley park on this line was in Island Park. Again, just on the, as you're going down Park Avenue, on the right-hand side, on the water side there, where the flea market used to be, that's where the trolley park was, and it was a big operation. But you have to wait till July to hear the Island Park lecture, because I'm going to do one on that too. I have lots of pictures of that. Fascinating. Including, as I promised at my last lecture, an actual picture of the horse diving into the pond. Amazing. They built another trolley barn at Vernon Avenue, and this is sort of up behind Jesus Savior. It's still there, and it's used by the roofing company. I can't think of the name. But it's still there. That building is still there. That was a trolley barn. And they also built another trolley barn on the, as the lines were extended, on the West Main Road near Green Lane. And we all saw that. That was there until 7 or 8 years ago, I guess now, when it was finally taken down. It was a bus barn for a while. But the problems of Stone Bridge continue to provide problems. And this is a trolley that looks like it's coming off the Stone Bridge, but it wasn't. It was stopped. That's as far as it went. Because people then would get on the Sanders or the west side, the two boats right here, and go across the Secundit River by ferry. And again, I don't know, fascinating pictures. There's so many of this. So the railroad, the trolley street railways consolidated a lot, and eventually came under the Bay State trolley line, which Bay State Railway, which was headquartered in Brockton. And again, the line was extended, the cross-town line was double-tracked, and so on. They also built a third line across to the Navy base. It went out from downtown Newport and over across the area to Gate 1 of the Navy base. That was another. But then they decided, because that was so successful in 1898, 1899, that they would build another trolley line on the island. And so they built one along the West Main Road. There were two trolley lines that both went the whole length of the island. The Newport and Bristol Ferry Railway, which became the Newport and Providence Railway, and a few others, was organized in 1902. And this one went, again, continuing on, it still covered the same part of downtown Newport down to Morton Park. But it went out from 1 Mile Corner, it went along the West Main Road and eventually to Bristol Ferry. Now, there were a couple problems with that. One was what we now call Raytheon Hill, which they couldn't negotiate, it was too steep. And another one was Turkey Hill, down at the bottom of the hill here, off Headley Street. Those were too steep, so the trolley lines went inland at that point, and they actually went into the middle of the island. If you're driving your car someday, if you dare look, when you go by West Main Pizza over on the West Main Road, just after that, before you get to the top of Raytheon Hill, you'll see the electric lines go down to the left and go down just beyond Locust Avenue. They go down into the Green Valley Golf Course, and that was where the trolley went. The electric company still held on to those lines, still holds on to those lines. They're National Grid lines now. So they had to go inland a couple places. And in Middletown, as you're going through Middletown, you'd see this scene. If you were to take this picture today, you would be standing in front of St. Lucy's Church, looking south, okay? This is Chase's Lane over here, all farm fields. Okay? And there was one house right over here, just out of the picture, that's owned by Edward Brown. Well, Edward Brown was important. He was the president of the trolley line. So he had his own station. If he wanted to go somewhere, he'd put his flag out there, and you know, they'd stop and pick him up. But again, you can see the sleighs are going through the really high drifts and everything on the road, and the trolley tracks nice and clear. They had snow plows, and they kept the tracks clear. But there were two farms from where St. Lucy's is to the East Main Road. Two farms on that side, and other farms on the other side. Amazing picture. I've used this slide a lot of times and then taken a modern view of the same thing. It's really depressing. When you got to Bristol Ferry, you came down, let's see, it came down over the hill through the camp meeting down here at the bottom of the hill. And again, you can see that the electric lines still go through that. It's pretty swampy in there now. But the line came down there, went down over the hill to Freeborn Street, turned right on Freeborn by the electric power plant that's down there, down Freeborn, and then took a left on Bristol Ferry, on Turnpike and Bristol Ferry. And when it got down to the other end, it turned onto what's now called Ferry Road. It turned left on Ferry Road and went down to this spot, which the remains of which are under the Mount Hope Bridge. You can still see the pilings for this station. You also can still see a couple pieces of trolley rail that are sitting there. But this must have been a Sunday afternoon. Everybody's all dressed up. And they must have been expecting a big crowd from the Bristol Ferry because you've got two open trolleys there. I don't know if I want to ride one of these from there to Newport, though. The trolley stops were quite elaborately decorated with all sorts of gingerbread on them. This is the Turnpike station at Freeborn Street. This is the station at Headley Street, right down at the bottom of the hill here. The costumes were that. They were costumes. These aren't pictures from the 1890s sometime. These are pictures from about the 1910, 1920 period and I have several of these from different parts of Portsmouth where these same ladies were all dressed up in costume. But in the distance, across the road this way, you can't see it very well on the slide, but is Headley Street. So it's right down there at the camp meeting. But you can see those power lines, they still go through there. I spend time doing things like that, trying to find these things. Now in Newport, in 1924, they were laying new track. And they were laying track along Broadway. Sound familiar? And then at Headley Street, you had this trolley that was left there. It's still there. A house has been built around it. And if you go down by the camp meeting, you'll see one building in there that has about, I don't know, 8 or 9 windows right in a row. And that's built around a trolley. And this was before they fixed it up. It's still there. They built a training station line as well. Trolley traffic peaked in the immediate pre-World War I period, and in the 20s it began to decline with the coming of the automobile, the jitney bus, and the bus. Jitney bus was a small bus, and this is the Fagio coach, which replaced a lot of the trolley lines. This one went Newport to Fall River. The Newport and Providence line had their own bus service, again under the leadership of William H. Vanderbilt, and his bus company put his trolley business out of business. Now here, in 1925, for some reason, because the trolley line were really hurting at this point, they decided to lay some new track along Broadway. And this track was being laid in 1924. Before that, I forgot the top half of this. Many of the trolleys, when they went out of business, were sold, a number of them, I think it was 6 of them, were sold to Asbury Park, New Jersey, and they loaded them on trains and hauled them out of here. A lot of the others just were sold for scrap. Anyway, these new tracks are being laid on Broadway, and there's really an interesting parallel here because, as we saw on the front page of the Newport Daily News about a month ago, these tracks that they were laying in 1924 were being torn up in April of 2013. You see the trolley tracks in the foreground here. This is right, you can see Newport Hospital in the background, okay, on Broadway. And be careful driving down there now. They put new sewer lines in, but boy, that's a bumpy road today. But they did find the trolley tracks, and they knew they were there, by the way. It was part of the bidding process. But same trolley tracks reappeared. Dave Hansen took this for the Daily News. I went down to take some, but they had covered it all up by then. So, in conclusion, the period of mass transportation changed quite dramatically during this 1890-1930 period. The ferries continued to function until the Mount Hope Bridge was built in 1929, the Secunda River Bridge in 1956, and the Newport Bridge in 1969 put them out of business. The railroads declined dramatically with the loss of passenger service in 1937-38, and again, the destruction of the railroad bridge really hurt them a lot. The steamboats declined after the Fall River line. In the middle of a strike, went out of business in 1937. But we still have some steamboats that patrol the bay and go out to Block Island and so on. And the street railways were replaced by the bus lines in 1925. Again, that reconstruction of the trolley lines was in 1924 on Broadway. In 1925, the trolleys ceased to operate. Interesting. Anyway, a whole era was disappeared and was replaced by the automobile. This picture is taken in Portsmouth. The stone walls on the left are still there. It's right just past Bernie's Dry Goods, looking down towards, just before you get to St. Anthony's. And all these buildings on the right are still there. But I guess it was a pretty heavy traffic day. One car on the East Main Road. But one of the things you can see in this picture too is the remains of the trolley tracks on the right. Okay? You can see them over there. Okay. And when the trolleys came, that also led to electrification, by the way. They had the poles up and they had the electricity, and eventually they developed power companies, and people's houses were electrified, electrically established in the 1900s and 1910s. That's it.